The First Crusade. November 27th, 1095, Clermont, France. Pope Urban II stands before a crowd in an open field. No church can hold this many people. They pack the field shoulder to shoulder, listening to the Pope speak about Christian pilgrims murdered on the roads to Jerusalem. He describes throats cut by Turkish bandit, bodies left for vultures. He speaks of holy sites desecrated under Muslim rule, churches turned to stables, altars smashed, priests driven into exile. He calls on the warriors of Europe to stop killing each other over strips of farmland, march east instead. And then he makes a promise that changes everything. Anyone who dies on this journey will have all sins forgiven. Immediate salvation, direct passage to heaven regardless of past transgressions. Thousands cry out Deus vult, which means God wills it in Latin. They take the cross on the spot, tearing fabric to sew crude crosses onto their tunics right there in the field. But before the main armies can organize disaster strikes with a charismatic preacher named Peter the Hermit, he begins rallying peasants throughout the Rhineland riding a donkey and wearing filthy robes. He is not a nobleman or trained warrior, just a wandering preacher speaking a language the poor understand. His sermons resonate with people who own nothing and have nothing to lose. He tells them God has called them specifically, not the rich knights, but them, forgotten, the expendable. Their poverty is a blessing, he says. Their lack of armor will be compensated by divine protection from God. By April 1096, perhaps 30,000 people are marching east toward Jerusalem, mostly unarmed, mostly untrained. Believing divine intervention will compensate for military skill, it does not. As they march through the Rhineland, some turn their fury against Jewish communities. They see Jews as enemies of Christ closer at hand than distant Muslims. What follows are some of the worst pogroms in medieval history at Speyer, Worms, Mainz, and Cologne. Massacres claim thousands of lives. Local bishops and nobles attempt to protect Jewish communities, sometimes successfully, often not. The People's Crusade has not yet left Europe. Already it is marked by atrocity. By August, they reach Constantinople. Emperor Alexios is horrified at this starving mob arriving at his gates. This is not the disciplined mercenary force he requested. This is an uncontrollable horde with no military training whatsoever. They have no respect for Byzantine authority and no realistic chance of surviving contact with Turkish forces. Alexios houses them in camps outside Constantinople, feeds them as best he can, urges Peter to wait for proper armor. Peter either cannot or will not control his followers. They pillage the suburbs, stealing food, burning buildings, assaulting Byzantine citizens. Alexios ferries the entire mob across the Bosphorus into Anatolia. He washes his hands of them. The Turkish commander watches the People's Crusade stumble into Anatolia, seeing a disorganized mob strung out over miles. No cavalry screen, no supply train, no defensive formation. He waits for the perfect moment to strike. In October 1096, Turkish forces attack near the town of Civitot just as dawn breaks. The attack comes from 3 directions at once, arrows falling like black rain on the barely awake camp. The slaughter is total. Peasants armed with clubs face Turkish cavalry on horses bred for speed and endurance. Untrained fighters break and run. They are hunted through forests and cut down, screams echoing through valleys. Peter the Hermit is absent, having returned to Constantinople for supplies. He survives while his followers die. Perhaps 3,000 manage to escape to the coast where Byzantine ships rescue them. The rest, 15,000 to 20,000 people, are killed or enslaved, their bones left to bleach under the Anatolian sun. The People's Crusade is over before it truly begins. A cautionary tale of faith replacing competence. But the real armies are coming, and they will prove far more dangerous. Throughout autumn and winter 1096, 4 major armies assemble across Europe. These are not mobs of peasants, but professional fighting forces led by experienced commanders. Duke Godfrey of Bouillon comes from Lorraine with several thousand knights trained from childhood to fight. Bohemond of Taranto arrives from southern Italy bringing 7,000 battle-hardened warriors who fought Muslims in Sicily. Raymond of Toulouse marches from southern France commanding perhaps 8,000 troops. Robert of Normandy comes from northern France, the son of William the Conqueror bringing 6,000 more warriors. All told, the combined armies number 30,000 fighting men, plus an equal number of non-combatants trailing behind. Pilgrims, clergy, women, children, servants, a great river of humanity marching east toward Jerusalem. It is the largest military expedition Europe has seen in centuries. Emperor Alexios greets each army as it arrives in Constantinople, feeling both relief and apprehension. Relief because these are genuine soldiers who might help push back the Turks. Apprehension because tens of thousands of armed foreigners who owe him no allegiance could threaten Constantinople itself. Alexios is a skilled diplomat. He extracts oaths of loyalty from each Crusader leader before ferrying them across the Bosphorus. Any territory reconquered from the Turks will return to Byzantine control. They swear on holy relics, including fragments of the true cross. Some leaders swear willingly and honestly. Others swear with mental reservation, already planning to carve out their own principalities. But for now, the oaths are sworn. The armies are ferried across. First Crusade begins in earnest. The first target is Nicaea, a heavily fortified Turkish city blocking the road to Jerusalem with massive walls and 200 towers. Sultan Kilij Arslan is away campaigning when the Crusaders arrive, confident after his easy victory over the People's Crusade. He thinks these new arrivals will be just as pathetic. He is wrong. On June 19, 1097, the garrison secretly negotiates with Byzantine forces overnight, surrendering the city to Alexios. The Crusaders wake to find Byzantine banners flying from walls they expected to assault at dawn. There will be no plunder, no sack, no massacre. Alexios pays them a modest sum and takes possession. The Crusaders are furious but have no choice. They swore oaths, they took Byzantine gold, they continue marching with anger simmering. On July 1st, 1097, near the town of Dorylaeum, the Crusader vanguard camps for the night. Bohemond of Taranto and Robert of Normandy command 7,000 troops separated from the main army to speed progress. They bed down with sentries posted at regular intervals. Just before dawn, the sentries see something terrifying. Thousands of Turkish cavalry pouring down from surrounding hills like a flood, completely encircling the valley. Sultan Kilij Arslan has brought his entire field army, perhaps 30,000 mounted archers who can shoot backwards while retreating. He intends to annihilate the Crusaders before they can reunite with the main force. The Crusaders scramble to form defensive positions. Knights don armor with shaking hands, infantry grab spears and shields. They know they are badly outnumbered and completely surrounded in this valley with no easy escape. Bohemond keeps his voice calm as he shouts orders, organizing knights into tight formation, creating order from rising chaos. The Turkish tactics are devastatingly effective. Mounted archers circle the Crusader formation at 50 yards, a moving ring of death that never stops shooting arrows. They never close to hand-to-hand combat. They never present a stationary target, always moving, always shooting, always out of reach. Arrows fall like lethal rain. They punch through mail and find gaps in armor, armpits, necks, the backs of knees. Men huddle behind shields, desperately trying to protect themselves, watching comrades fall around them, blood spreading in the dirt. When Crusader knights form up to charge, the Turks simply scatter like ghosts. The knights thunder forward with lances leveled that they are charging at nothing. The Turks melt away, shooting arrows as they retreat, then reform once the charge exhausts itself. For 3 or 4 hours, the battle continues. The Crusaders are being bled to death slowly and professionally. By mid-morning, the situation is desperate. Some knights are praying, commending their souls to God, convinced they are about to die. Bohemond sends messengers racing back with desperate pleas. If relief does not arrive within hours, his entire force will be destroyed. Then, like salvation itself, the rest of the Crusader army appears on the Turkish flank. Godfrey of Bouillon, Raymond of Toulouse, Robert of Flanders. Thousands of fresh troops deploying for battle in perfect formation. The surprise is total and catastrophic for the Turks, who were focused entirely on Bohemond's trapped contingent. Turkish units caught between two forces cannot coordinate response, cannot maintain their hit-and-run tactics against attacks from two directions. The Crusader heavy cavalry finally has a solid target. Knights on powerful war horses crash into Turkish formations like an iron avalanche. The shock shatters the Turkish front ranks. Horses and riders go down in tangles, screaming flesh and breaking bones, mixing with steel. The Turkish line buckles. Units begin to pull back, attempting to reform at a safe distance from the devastating cavalry charges, but retreat turns into rout as more and more units disengage and flee into the Anatolian interior. By early afternoon, Kilij Arslan orders general retreat. His army streams away, leaving behind hundreds of dead and their baggage train. The Battle of Dorylaeum is over. The Crusaders have won their first major field battle against Turkish forces. Both sides understand this will be a long, brutal war. Every battle will be won through skill, tactics, and luck. The Crusaders press onward toward their next objective, the great city of Antioch. By October 1097, the Crusader army arrives outside Antioch, one of the oldest and greatest cities in Christendom. Antioch sits at a strategic location where major trade routes converge, protected by massive fortifications rising up Mount Silpius. Walls studded with hundreds of towers, gates reinforced with iron, citadels perched on hilltops overlooking the city like watching eagles. The garrison, commanded by Turkish governor Yagisian, numbers 7,000 well-supplied soldiers behind impregnable Roman-built defenses. The Crusaders number 40 to 50,000, including non-combatants. They lack the siege equipment to take such a fortress by storm. They settle in for a siege that will last 8 months. What follows is one of the most brutal sieges of the medieval period. Winter sets in and Antioch's climate is cold and wet. The Crusaders camped in the open suffer terribly, huddled under torn tents that let in rain and wind. Food runs short as Turkish forces raid foraging parties. Horses die by the hundreds, either from starvation or slaughtered for food. Knights weep as they kill their war horses. Men begin to desert, stealing away in the night, unable to endure another day of gnawing hunger and freezing rain. Disease sweeps through the camps. Dysentery and typhus claim more lives than Turkish arrowsmen waste away to skeletons. By spring 1098, the army has lost perhaps a third of its strength to starvation and disease. Inside Antioch, the garrison is still well supplied. But morale declines as months pass, with no relief arriving from Muslim rulers. On June 3, 1098, the siege reaches dramatic climax through betrayal from within the walls. Bohemond of Taranto has been secretly negotiating with an Armenian tower captain named Firuz, who has a grievance against the governor. The exact reason is unclear, perhaps money owed, perhaps an insult, perhaps fear of what will happen if the city falls by assault. He is willing to sell his honor for gold and promises of safety from the Crusaders. Firuz agrees to allow Crusaders through his tower. In exchange, Bohemond promises protection, money, land in the new Crusader kingdom. Late on the night of June 2nd, Bohemond leads 60 knights to the tower in complete darkness. Ladders are raised silently. Knights climb, praying their armor does not clank, praying no sentry glances in their direction. They reach the top and scramble over battlements. They cut down the few guards before they can raise alarm. More Crusaders follow. Hundreds pouring through the captured tower. Gates are opened from inside. The main Crusader army floods into Antioch. What follows is chaos and slaughter throughout the narrow streets of the city. The garrison, caught by surprise, attempts to organize defense. They fight in doorways, on staircases, anywhere they can make a stand. They are overwhelmed by sheer numbers. Governor Yagisian flees the city with a small escort attempting to escape. He is caught and killed by Armenian peasants seeking revenge for years of Turkish rule. The Crusaders sweep through Antioch, killing Turkish soldiers and plundering homes. Any building that looks wealthy becomes a looting target. By dawn on June 3rd, Antioch is in Crusader hands. But there is no time to celebrate. Kerboga, the Atabeg of Mosul, has been marching for weeks with a massive coalition army from across the Muslim world. Perhaps 40 to 50,000 troops, including Turks, Arabs, and Persians, assembled under one banner to relieve Antioch. He arrives on June 7th, 4 days after Antioch falls to the Crusaders. He immediately lays siege to the city. The situation is now reversed, with Crusaders trapped inside Antioch, surrounded by Muslim forces. The Crusader states are established, the Kingdom of Jerusalem stretching from coast to the Jordan River, the Principality of Antioch in the north, the County of Edessa in the northeast, later the County of Tripoli on the Lebanese coast. For nearly 200 years, these fragile European outposts will cling to existence, constantly at war with Muslim neighbors, dependent on a steady stream of reinforcements from Europe, always one major defeat away from extinction. The First Crusade has succeeded beyond anyone's wildest expectations, but the Crusader states will spend the next 2 centuries fighting for survival, and Muslim leaders are already planning their response. From Pope Urban's speech in 1095 to the fall of Jerusalem in 1099. 4 years of brutal warfare transforming 30,000 peasants and professional knights into conquerors of the Holy Land. The People's Crusade massacred in Anatolia, the professional armies winning at Dorylaeum, surviving Antioch, capturing Jerusalem. The First Crusade succeeded against impossible odds. It established kingdoms in hostile territory thousands of miles from home. It demonstrated that European heavy cavalry could defeat Turkish mounted archers. That faith, combined with military discipline, could overcome starvation, disease, and overwhelming numbers. But it also established a pattern that would repeat for 2 centuries. Brutal sieges, mass casualties from disease, internal disputes among Crusader leaders, and massacres that would poison Christian-Muslim relations for generations. The Second Crusade. For nearly half a century, the Crusader states cling to survival in the hostile deserts of the Holy Land. Superior castle defenses and occasional European reinforcements keep them alive. Muslim disunity keeps their enemies divided. But the balance is about to shift catastrophically. Christmas Eve, 1144. The city of Edessa falls to Muslim forces after a brutal siege. The First Crusader state has fallen. Europe is shocked. The Pope calls for a new crusade, and 2 kings will personally lead armies to disaster. This is the Second Crusade, the crusade where everything goes wrong. Subscribe if you are not already subscribed. Let us begin. Christmas Eve, 1144. Zengi, the Atabeg of Mosul and Aleppo, lays siege to Edessa, battering the walls with siege engines. The garrison fights desperately, but cannot hold against the overwhelming assault on the northernmost Crusader state. The city that has been Christian for 46 years is about to fall. On Christmas Eve, the walls are breached. Zengi's forces pour in. The Christian population is massacred or enslaved. The garrison slaughtered. The First Crusader state has fallen. News reaches Europe months later. The reaction is shock and alarm. If Edessa can fall, what of Antioch or Jerusalem itself? Pope Eugenius III calls for a new crusade to save the Holy Land. But the man who truly galvanizes Europe is Bernard of Clairvaux, the most famous monk in Christendom, whose reputation for holiness and eloquence is unmatched across Europe. When Bernard begins preaching the crusade in 1146, entire crowds weep. They fall to their knees, convinced by his words. Contemporary chroniclers claim he heals the sick with a touch radiating divine grace. Whether literal truth or hagiography, the effect is undeniable. Thousands take the cross after hearing Bernard preach. Critically, Bernard convinces 2 reigning monarchs to lead personally. King Louis VII of France vows to take the cross. King Conrad III of Germany, not wanting to be outdone by France, does the same. Europe is confident of success. That confidence will prove tragically misplaced. In May 1147, Conrad leads his German army eastward, perhaps 20,000 strong, marching through friendly Christian lands uneventfully. But when they reach Constantinople, tensions arise. Emperor Manuel I eyes this massive foreign army with suspicion, wanting them gone quickly. Conrad, impatient and overconfident, makes a fatal decision. Rather than following the safer coastal route, he marches through Anatolia's interior. It is catastrophic. The Anatolia of 1147 is not the Anatolia of 50 years earlier. Turkish control has solidified across the region. Roads are not maintained. Water sources are scarce and contested. Local populations view Crusaders as invaders rather than liberators. By late October, the German army is deep in hostile territory, strung out over miles of mountains with supplies low. Turkish forces shadow them constantly, launching raids, attacking stragglers, bleeding the army slowly like wolves culling a herd. On October 25th, near Dorylaeum, the Turks strike in force. Perhaps 20,000 Turkish cavalry descend on the German column, the same place where the First Crusade won its first great victory. This time, the outcome is different. The German infantry, exhausted and demoralized, attempts to form positions in a valley with cliffs on both sides. Terrain makes formation impossible. They are caught with nowhere to maneuver, nowhere to retreat, as Turkish mounted archers circle, shooting from distance, never closing to melee. German knights attempt cavalry charges, but the Turks scatter and reform their horses fresh. For hours, the slaughter continues. Men fall by the hundreds, by the thousands. Baggage train is captured. The army disintegrates. Conrad himself is wounded. an arrow grazing his head and nearly killing him. He only escapes because his bodyguard forms a shield wall. By nightfall, perhaps 9/10 of the German army is dead or scattered. Conrad retreats to Nicaea with maybe 2,000 survivors. The German contingent of the Second Crusade is destroyed. It never even reaches the Holy Land. King Louis, hearing of Conrad's catastrophe, takes the coastal route, marching cautiously, staying close to the coast through Byzantine Anatolia. But even this safer route is plagued with difficulties. Turkish raiders harry the French, constantly attacking stragglers and ambushing foraging parties. Louis's army bleeds, slowly losing men every day to constant skirmishing. Supplies run low, horses die or are captured. By the time they reach Antioch in March 1148, they are exhausted, depleted, and demoralized. Conrad, having recovered from his wounds, joins Louis. Together they command 10 to 12,000 effective fighting men, a fraction of the mighty host that set out from Europe with such confidence months earlier. The Crusade leaders meet to discuss strategy. The obvious target is Edessa, whose fall prompted this entire crusade. But Edessa lies far to the northeast through hostile territory. The battered Crusaders are not eager for more suffering. Someone suggests Damascus. Damascus, one of the jewels of the Islamic world. Wealthy and strategically positioned, also an ally of the Kingdom of Jerusalem. A buffer state protecting Crusader territories from Egyptian and Turkish aggression, protecting the Kingdom of Jerusalem from invasion. But the Crusaders believe they can capture Damascus and dominate the region. It is a spectacular miscalculation. On July 20th, 1148, the combined Crusader army arrives at Damascus. Reinforced by troops from Jerusalem, they number perhaps 20,000. Damascus is protected by formidable walls, well supplied, garrisoned by several thousand soldiers who are now motivated to fight to the death. The Crusaders initially attack from the west through orchards, making progress for 3 days. Pushing closer to walls, capturing outer positions, believing victory is within reach against the isolated city. Inside Damascus, the governor sends desperate messages begging every Muslim power for relief. The Muslim world responds with armies converging. Reinforcements pour into the city from Aleppo, from Mosul, from across Syria as the siege continues. By July 23rd, the Crusaders realize they face not an isolated city, but an entire regional coalition. In a moment of strategic confusion, the leadership decides to shift attack from the western orchards to the eastern side. The reasoning is unclear. Some sources suggest they believed eastern walls were weaker. Others hint at bribes paid to shift position. Whatever the cause, the decision is disastrous, providing no cover, no water, no advantage whatsoever on the eastern approach. Within days, the Crusader position becomes untenable. Muslim reinforcements arrive by the thousands. Crusaders exposed on open ground begin suffering heavy casualties. Morale collapses. Accusations fly between factions. French nobles accuse Germans of cowardice. Germans accuse French of incompetence. Local barons accuse Europeans of stupidity. On July 28th, after only 8 days of siege, the leaders order retreat, abandoning the siege of Damascus. The Second Crusade has accomplished nothing. Worse than nothing, it has turned an allied city into an enemy and demonstrated Crusader armies can be defeated. King Conrad returns to Germany in disgrace, arriving home in 1149 with barely 1/10 of his army. King Louis remains in the Holy Land for another year, accomplishing nothing before sailing home in 1150. The Second Crusade is over, having achieved nothing, wasted enormous resources, cost thousands of lives, and weakened the Crusader position. But most dangerously, it has awakened the Muslim world to the possibility of unified resistance. Among the young officers serving in the armies that relieved Damascus is a Kurdish soldier named Saladin. He has learned valuable lessons. He has seen European armies falter and break, the weakness of Crusader divisions. Within a generation, he will put those lessons into practice. He will bring the Kingdom of Jerusalem to its knees. The Third Crusade. On a sweltering July day in 1188, two armies met near a barren hilltop in Galilee. The Christian forces of Jerusalem, weary and desperate for water, found themselves surrounded. By nightfall, the Kingdom of Jerusalem had collapsed. The battle was called Hattin, and it changed everything. Within months, the Muslim Sultan Saladin swept through the Crusader territories like a flood. Acre fell. Jaffa fell. Nazareth, Caesarea Tiberias, one fortress after another opened its gates. Then, on October 2nd, 1180, Saladin entered Jerusalem itself. 90 years of Christian rule over the Holy City ended in a single afternoon. The news traveled slowly across the Mediterranean, carried by exhausted refugees and a desperate archbishop named Josias of Tyre. When it reached Rome, Pope Urban III reportedly died from the shock. His successor, Gregory VIII, wasted no time. Within days of taking office, he issued a call that echoed across Christendom: Jerusalem must be retaken. But this would not be like the Crusades before it. This time it wouldn't be landless knights and peasant armies answering the call. Three of Europe's most powerful kings prepared to march east. Frederick Barbarossa of Germany was nearly 70 years old, a white-bearded emperor who had crusaded once before as a young man. Philip Augustus of France was ambitious and calculating, always watching for opportunities to expand his power. And then there was Richard of England, a warrior prince who would soon inherit his father's crown and earn a nickname that would outlive them all: Lionheart. To fund the expedition, England and France imposed what became known as the Saladin tithe, 10% tax on all income and movable goods. It was an extraordinary measure, and it proved just how seriously Europe took this mission. The wealth of kingdoms was being liquidated to reclaim a city half a world away. In January 1188, at Gisors, King Henry II of England and Philip Augustus temporarily set aside their war with each other and agreed to take the cross together. But Henry would never see Jerusalem. He died in July 1189, and the English forces passed to his son, Richard. Richard threw himself into preparations with almost reckless energy. He sold offices, sheriffdoms, castles, anything that could be converted to cash. He even joked that he would sell London itself if he could find a buyer. By the time he departed in 1190, he had assembled a fleet of 100 ships carrying some 17,000 men. Frederick Barbarossa left first. In May 1189, he departed from Regensburg with what chroniclers called the largest crusading army ever assembled. Disciplined, battle-hardened, and led by a man who knew the way, the German army was supposed to be unstoppable. But the journey east proved harder than anyone anticipated. The Byzantine Emperor Isaac Angelus had secretly made a treaty with Saladin. Rather than help the Crusaders, he did everything he could to slow them down. Frederick's patience finally snapped. He captured the city of Adrianople and held it until the Byzantines agreed to ferry his army across the straits into Turkey. Once in Anatolia, the Germans fought their way through Seljuk Turkish territory. In May 1190, they defeated a Turkish army near Iconium, and the road to the Holy Land finally seemed clear. Frederick was so close now, just a few more weeks, and he would reach the coast. Then, on June 10th, 1190, while crossing the Göksu River in Cilicia, Frederick Barbarossa drowned. Some accounts say his horse stumbled, others say he tried to swim across and was swept away by the current. But the result was the same. The emperor, who had survived decades of warfare, political intrigue, and the long journey east, died in a river that barely reached his chest. Some chroniclers say the soldiers wept openly, others simply packed up and went home. A small remnant under Frederick's son and Duke Leopold of Austria limped on to the Holy Land, but the great German crusade died with Frederick in that river. To Saladin and his forces, who had been genuinely alarmed by the approaching German host, it seemed like divine intervention. Richard and Philip, meanwhile, had left separately. They met in Sicily, where Richard immediately caused trouble. His sister Joanna, the widow of Sicily's late king, was being held by the new ruler Tancred of Lecce, who refused to return her dowry. Richard didn't ask twice. He stormed the city of Messina and took it by force. Tancred caved and paid up. Philip was not amused. The French king was beginning to realize that Richard was not going to be an easy partner. They stayed in Sicily through the winter, and the tensions only grew. By the time they left in spring 1191, they weren't even traveling together. Richard's fleet sailed east, but a violent storm scattered his ships off the coast of Cyprus. Several vessels ran aground, including one carrying treasure meant to fund the crusade. Another ship, desperately seeking shelter, held Richard's sister Joanna and his fiancée, Berengaria of Navarre. The ruler of Cyprus, a Byzantine rebel named Isaac Comnene, seized the treasure and effectively held the women prisoner on their ship. When Richard learned what happened, he sailed to Cyprus and demanded his property back. Isaac responded with insults, so Richard invaded. Within weeks, he had conquered the entire island. He married Berengaria at Limassol, placed the island under English control, and continued on to the Holy Land. It was an accidental conquest. Richard had never planned to take Cyprus, but it would prove vital. The island became a supply base for Crusader operations for the next 4 centuries. By the time Richard arrived at Acre in June 1191, the city had been under siege for nearly 2 years. What had started as a bold attempt by the deposed King of Jerusalem, Guy of Lusignan, to strike back at Saladin had turned into a nightmarish standoff. The Crusaders besieged Acre. Saladin's army besieged the besiegers. Disease tore through both camps. Thousands died not from swords, but from dysentery, fever, and starvation. Philip had arrived at Acre a few weeks earlier, and when Richard's ships appeared on the horizon, the siege finally had the manpower it needed. Richard immediately began building siege engines, coordinating assaults, and driving the operation forward. On July 12th, 1191, Acre surrendered. It should have been a moment of triumph. Instead, it became a source of bitter division. Richard, Philip, and Duke Leopold quarreled over the spoils. When Leopold raised his banner over part of the city, Richard tore it down and threw it in the mud. It was a calculated insult, and Leopold never forgot it. Then there was the question of who would be king of Jerusalem. Guy of Lusignan had started the siege, but his claim to the throne had been through his wife Sibylla, who had died during the siege. Many barons now supported Conrad of Montferrat, who had married Sibylla's sister Isabella. Richard backed Guy, Philip and Leopold backed Conrad. The crusade that was supposed to unite Christendom against a common enemy was fracturing over politics. Philip Augustus had had enough. In August 1191, claiming illness, he left for France. Some said he was genuinely sick. Others believed he saw an opportunity to invade Richard's lands while Richard was stuck in the Holy Land. Either way, Philip's departure left Richard in command, but also alone. Richard pushed south along the coast. Saladin's forces shadowed him every step of the way. At Arsuf, they clashed, and Richard's forces held the field. The Crusaders retook Jaffa and established a strong foothold along the coast. For a moment, it looked like momentum was shifting. Twice, Richard led his army to within sight of Jerusalem. Twice, he stopped. His advisors warned him that even if they took the city, they couldn't hold it. Supply lines were stretched thin, the Crusader army was exhausted, and Saladin's forces were still intact. Taking Jerusalem would be a symbolic victory, but it would likely end in disaster when Saladin counterattacked. Richard knew they were right, but the decision haunted him. He had come all this way. Jerusalem was right there, visible on the horizon, and he turned back. By the summer of 1192, both sides were exhausted. Saladin's treasury was depleted, his soldiers were tired, and Richard received troubling news from England. His brother John was making moves to seize the throne. Richard needed to go home. In late July, Saladin launched a surprise attack on Jaffa, hoping to retake the city before Richard could respond. The garrison held out just long enough to send word. Richard rushed back with a small force and retook the city in a dramatic counterattack. It was his last major action in the Holy Land. On September 2nd, 1192, Richard and Saladin signed the Treaty of Jaffa. It was not the victory Richard had hoped for. Jerusalem would remain under Muslim control, but Christians would be allowed to visit the city as unarmed pilgrims. The Crusaders would hold the coastal strip from Tyre to Jaffa. Ascalon's fortifications would be demolished and returned to Saladin. The treaty guaranteed a 3-year truce. Neither man was happy with it, but both needed it. Saladin's health was failing, and he knew his empire might not survive a long war. Richard needed to get home before his kingdom fell apart. The treaty was a compromise born of exhaustion and necessity. Richard left Acre on October 9th, 1192. He tried to sail home via the Mediterranean, but the French ports were closed to him. His old enemy, the Count of Toulouse, was waiting to capture him in Marseille. So Richard turned north, attempting to make his way overland through Central Europe. It was a catastrophic mistake. Traveling in disguise, Richard tried to pass through Austria undetected. But in December 1192, near Vienna, he was recognized and arrested by Duke Leopold. Same Leopold whose banner Richard had torn down at Acre. Leopold handed Richard over to the Holy Roman Emperor Henry VI, who saw an opportunity. Henry demanded a ransom of 150,000 marks, 2 to 3 times the annual income of the English crown. It was the same amount that had been raised by the Saladin tithe. Now it would all go to a European emperor instead of funding a holy war. Back in England, Richard's mother, Eleanor of Aquitaine, worked tirelessly to raise the ransom. Churches were stripped of their gold and silver, clergy and laymen were taxed a quarter of their property, the entire kingdom was bled dry to free their king. Philip of France even offered Henry more money to keep Richard imprisoned, but Henry refused. On February 4th, 1194, after 14 months in captivity, Richard was released. He returned to England briefly, then spent the rest of his life fighting wars in France. He never returned to the Holy Land. In April 1199, while besieging a castle in Limousin, he was struck by a crossbow bolt. The wound became infected, and Richard the Lionheart died at the age of 41. Saladin never saw Richard again. He died on March 4th, 1193, just 6 months after the treaty was signed. The empire he had built immediately began to fracture as his sons and brothers fought over the succession. The unified Muslim front that had made Saladin so formidable dissolved into competing dynasties. The Third Crusade failed to achieve its stated goal. Jerusalem remained in Muslim hands, and it would stay that way for another 40 years. But measured by other standards, the Crusade was far from a total failure. The coastal cities, Acre, Jaffa, Tyre, remained in Christian hands and would serve as the base for Crusader operations for another century. Cyprus became a lasting Christian kingdom that endured for over 300 years. And the Kingdom of Jerusalem, though reduced to a coastal strip, survived. Perhaps most importantly, the Third Crusade established a new model for how crusades could end. Not with total victory or total defeat, but with negotiated settlements that allowed both sides to claim something. The Treaty of Jaffa set a precedent. It showed that even in an age defined by religious warfare, practical compromises were possible. Richard and Saladin never met in person, but their relationship defined the crusade. They exchanged gifts and letters during negotiations. They respected each other's military skill. Medieval chroniclers on both sides spoke of them with admiration. In later centuries, their rivalry would be romanticized into something almost mythic. Christian knight and the Muslim sultan, two warriors bound by codes of honor. The reality was messier. Richard could be brutal. He executed prisoners, burned villages, and alienated allies with his arrogance. Saladin was a shrewd politician who knew when to be merciful and when to be ruthless. Neither was the perfect knight of legend, but together they shaped one of the most significant conflicts of the medieval age. The Third Crusade was supposed to be the crusade that finally united Europe under a single purpose. Instead, it became a story of brilliant leaders undermined by politics, personal rivalries, and the impossible logistics of waging war thousands of miles from home. 3 kings set out, one drowned before reaching the battlefield, one went home early, and one fought brilliantly but couldn't finish what he started. In the end, Jerusalem remained beyond reach, not because the Crusaders lacked courage or skill, but because taking a city and halting it are two different things. The Third Crusade proved that even kings, even armies, even faith itself cannot always overcome geography, politics, and the simple arithmetic of supply lines and garrison strength. It was a crusade of might-have-beens. If Frederick hadn't drowned, if Philip had stayed, if Richard had more men, more time, more allies willing to stick it out. But history is made of what happened, not what might have been. And what happened was this 3 kings went to war, and none of them got what they wanted. But in the trying, they changed the world anyway. The Fourth Crusade. 1204, Constantinople burns. The greatest city in Christendom is being systematically looted by crusaders who swore oaths to liberate Jerusalem. Churches are stripped of treasures, libraries containing irreplaceable manuscripts go up in flames. Women are raped, men are murdered, all by soldiers wearing crosses on their tunics. The Fourth Crusade never reached the Holy Land. It never fought Muslims. Instead, it shattered the unity of Christendom in what historians consider one of the great crimes of the medieval period. This is how a crusade to Egypt became the sack of Constantinople. Subscribe if you are not already subscribed. Let us begin. Pope Innocent III calls for a new crusade in 1198 with a sound strategy. Invade Egypt, the power base of Saladin's Ayyubid dynasty. Use control of Egypt as leverage to force the return of Jerusalem. It is the strategy the Fourth Crusade was supposed to follow. But it requires ships, an enormous fleet capable of transporting tens of thousands across the Mediterranean to invade Egypt successfully. The Crusade leaders approach Venice, the dominant naval power in the Mediterranean, with unmatched shipbuilding capacity. Venice agrees to build and provide ships capable of transporting 33,500 men and 4,500 horses to Egypt. The price is astronomical, 85,000 silver marks more than the annual revenue of most European kingdoms combined. But the Crusade leaders agree confident that when Crusaders assemble in Venice, they will have the numbers and funds promised. They are catastrophically wrong in their estimates. In summer 1202, Crusaders begin arriving in Venice, excited to embark on the crusade to Egypt. But instead of 33,000 men, only about 12,000 appear at the Venetian port, ready to sail. Many nobles who pledged to take the cross made other arrangements, sailing directly from other ports without Venetian ships. Others simply changed their minds, deciding crusading was too expensive, too dangerous, better left to more foolish men seeking glory. The Crusaders who do arrive find themselves in an impossible situation, trapped in Venice without means to pay. They owe Venice 85,000 marks, but can raise only about 50,000 from those actually present. And Venice, which spent a fortune building ships for an army that never materialized, is not pleased with the situation. The Venetian Doge Enrico Dandolo is 90 years old and blind from age, but he is nobody's fool when it comes to Venetian commercial interests. He has invested the wealth of the Venetian state in this enterprise, expecting full payment. And he intends to be paid one way or another from these Crusaders who cannot leave without his ships. He makes an offer to the desperate Crusaders trapped in Venice without means to continue to Egypt. If they will help Venice recapture the city of Zara on the Dalmatian coast, he will defer payment of the debt, a city that recently defected to Hungarian control, damaging Venetian commercial interests in the Adriatic. The Crusade leaders, with no other options and unable to sail without Venetian cooperation, reluctantly agreed to the diversion. In November 1202, the Crusade fleet sails to Egypt, but to Zara, attacking a Christian city. They besiege and capture Zara on behalf of Venetian commercial interests, having not yet fought a single Muslim. Pope Innocent III is furious when he learns of this betrayal. He excommunicates the entire Crusader army for attacking Christians. The excommunication is lifted for most Crusaders, though the Venetians remain under the ban of the Church. The Fourth Crusade has not yet left Europe. Already it has attacked a Christian city and been excommunicated by the Pope. It is about to get much, much worse than anyone could possibly imagine. While the Crusaders are camped at Zara over winter, a Byzantine prince arrives with an extraordinary proposal. Alexios Angelo claims his father, Emperor Isaac II, was deposed and blinded in a palace coup in Constantinople. His uncle now sits on the Byzantine throne as Alexios III, having seized power through treachery and violence. Young Alexios begs the Crusaders to help him restore his father to power, promising generous payment for their assistance. In exchange, he promises 200,000 silver marks to pay off the entire Venetian debt. 10,000 Byzantine troops to join the crusade to Egypt after he is restored to power in Constantinople. The submission of the Eastern Orthodox Church to papal authority, ending the schism between East and West. Food and supplies for the Crusader army. It seems too good to be true. It is. But the Crusader leaders, deeply in debt to Venice and desperate for a solution, agree to this new diversion from Egypt. In June 1203, the Crusade fleet arrives at Constantinople instead of Egypt, the greatest city in Christendom, capital of the Byzantine Empire, home to perhaps 500,000 people. Protected by the most formidable fortifications in the world, built and reinforced over centuries of Roman engineering, the Crusaders and Venetians besiege the city, attacking their fellow Christians on behalf of a deposed Byzantine prince. They breach the harbor defenses using Venetian naval expertise accumulated over centuries of Mediterranean naval warfare. They set fires that burn entire quarters of the city, destroying homes and churches. Emperor Alexios III, seeing the defenses crumbling, flees during the night with what treasure he can carry. The Byzantine nobility, desperate to avoid further destruction, releases Isaac II from prison, restoring him to the throne. They restore him with his son Alexios as co-emperor, hoping to satisfy the Crusaders. The Crusaders camp outside the walls, waiting for their promised payment of 200,000 silver marks. It never comes. coins. The Byzantine treasury, it turns out, does not contain 200,000 silver marks, as young Alexios had claimed. Young Emperor Alexios IV cannot fulfill his extravagant promises made to convince Crusaders to attack Constantinople. The people of Constantinople are furious at having Crusaders camped outside their walls demanding impossible payment, at seeing their city burned and defenses breached on behalf of a usurper's promises that cannot be kept. They riot in the streets demanding the Crusaders leave immediately. In January 1204, a palace coup deposes and murders Alexios IV, ending any hope of payment. A nobleman named Alexios Doukas seizes power as Alexios V, telling the Crusaders to leave immediately without payment. There will be no payment, no Byzantine troops, no supplies, nothing. The Crusaders are broke, stranded in Byzantine territory, unable to afford passage to Egypt, staring at the richest city in the world filled with gold and treasure, watching gold and silver pass by on the streets while they starve in camps outside the walls. On March 12, 1204, the Crusader and Venetian leaders make a decision that will echo through history as one of the great crimes of the medieval period, forever staining the Crusade movement. They will conquer Constantinople, divide the Byzantine Empire among themselves, take by force what they cannot obtain by agreement or payment. The Fourth Crusade will never reach the Holy Land. On April 9th, 1204, the final assault on Constantinople begins, with Venetian ships ramming the harbor walls. Crusader siege engines pound the Theodosian walls, the fortifications that have protected the city for nearly 1,000 years from countless enemies. For 3 days, the assault continues. Wave after wave of Crusader troops hurl themselves at the defenses with desperate fury, thrown back with heavy casualties. Regrouping, attacking again, Byzantine defenders fighting with desperate courage, knowing what awaits if the city falls. Knowing that if the city falls, they will face massacre and enslavement at the hands of fellow Christians. But the Crusaders have superior siege equipment and numerical advantage over the defenders, and the fury of men who believe they have been cheated of promised payment driving them forward relentlessly. On April 12, 1204, sections of the wall are finally breached after 3 days of constant assault. Crusader and Venetian forces pour into Constantinople through the breached walls like water through a broken dam. What follows over the next 3 days is one of the greatest cultural catastrophes in human history, beyond description. For 3 days, Crusaders who swore oaths to liberate Jerusalem loot and burn through the greatest Christian city. Churches are stripped of their treasures, holy relics stolen or destroyed for their gold and jewels by men claiming to serve Christ. The Hagia Sophia, the greatest church in Christendom, is systematically looted by Crusaders seeking treasure. Built by Emperor Justinian 900 years earlier, its priceless mosaics torn down, its altar melted for precious metals. Prostitutes dancing on the patriarch's throne while drunken soldiers cheer. Libraries containing irreplaceable ancient manuscripts go in flames. The accumulated wisdom of 1,000 years destroyed in 3 days of uncontrolled looting and burning. Palaces are burned. Monuments destroyed. Artwork that survived from classical antiquity is lost forever in the flames. Women are raped. Men are murdered. Byzantine chronicler Niketas Choniates witnesses the sack personally and records the horror. He writes of Crusaders melting down priceless works of art for the of drunken soldiers defiling churches, of monks and nuns murdered in their monasteries, their bodies left to rot in sacred spaces by men wearing crosses. The exact death toll will never be known, but Byzantine sources estimate tens of thousands killed or enslaved in 3 days. The material damage is incalculable. Centuries of accumulated wealth and culture destroyed in 3 days of uncontrolled looting beyond measure. The Crusaders established the Latin Empire of Constantinople, a feudal state ruled by Baldwin of Flanders as emperor of the conquered city. Venetians take key ports and islands throughout the Aegean, securing their commercial dominance for centuries to come. The Byzantine Empire weakened and fragmented, splits into competing successor states in Nicaea, Trebizond, and Epirus fighting each other. It will eventually recover Constantinople in 1261 after decades of exile, but it will never regain its former power or glory lost in the catastrophic sack of 1204. The Fourth Crusade is officially over. Having never reached Egypt, and never fought Muslims. Accomplished nothing in terms of liberating the Holy Land from Muslim control. Instead, it shattered the unity of Christendom, weakened the Christian position in the East for generations to come, created a legacy of mistrust between Catholic and Orthodox Christians that endures to this day. If you made it this far, you just learned the complete story of the Fourth Crusade, from crusaders arriving in Venice unable to pay for ships they had ordered, to sacking Zara to pay off Venetian debts, to attacking Constantinople to restore a prince who promised money he did not have, to finally conquering and looting Constantinople for 3 days because they were broke, angry, and staring at the richest city in the world. The crusade that proves good intentions mean nothing when financial desperation meets Venetian commercial interests and weak leadership. The Great Betrayal. The catastrophe that stained the crusading movement forever. The Fifth Crusade. August 1221. A Crusader army is trapped in a swamp near the Egyptian town of Mansoura. Water surrounds them on our sides, supplies are gone, horses are drowning, men are dying of disease. The Nile flood has cut off their retreat. They marched into Egypt during flood season, and now they are paying the price. The Fifth Crusade is the one where everything almost worked. The strategy was sound. Attack Egypt, capture the Nile Delta, force negotiations. They captured Damietta after 18 months of brutal siege. They were offered Jerusalem twice in exchange for peace, and they threw it on away by marching on Cairo in the middle of summer during flood season. This is the story of how bad leadership destroyed a well-planned campaign. Subscribe if you are not already subscribed. Let us begin. The Fifth Crusade is called by Pope Innocent III at the Fourth Lateran Council in 1215. Innocent is determined to redeem the disaster of the Fourth Crusade. No more Venetian scheming, no more attacking Christians. This time the Pope wants direct control. The target is Egypt. After the Third Crusade, everyone recognizes that Egypt is the key. It is the wealthiest province in the Muslim world, the agricultural heartland, the source of Ayyubid military power. If the Crusaders can conquer Egypt, they can force the Muslims to negotiate the return of Jerusalem. It is a good plan. Innocent dies in 1216, and his successor, Pope Honorius III, continues the crusade. The first wave of Crusaders depart in 1217, led by King Andrew II of Hungary and Duke Leopold VI of Austria. They sail to Acre and conduct some minor raids in the Holy Land and accomplish nothing significant. Andrew, unimpressed with the whole situation, goes home in 1218 after fulfilling the minimum time required for a crusade vow. The real crusade begins in 1218 when a larger force of German, Italian, and French crusaders arrives. They decide to attack Egypt. The Crusaders choose Damietta as their target. Damietta is a fortified port city at the mouth of the Nile, the gateway to the Nile Delta and Cairo. Capture Damietta and the Crusaders control access to the Egyptian interior. The siege begins in May 1218. The Crusader fleet sails into the Nile and begins blockading the city. But Damietta has a unique defense. A massive chain stretches across the river between the city and a fortified tower on an island. The chain blocks ships from advancing. The tower is heavily garrisoned and constantly resupplied from the city. As long as the tower stands, the Crusaders cannot fully blockade Damietta. The Crusaders build a floating siege tower on 2 ships lashed together. In August 1218, they attack the chain tower. The assault is brutal. Crusaders scale the walls under heavy fire. Muslim defenders throw Greek fire and drop stones. Finally, the Crusaders overwhelm the defenders and capture the tower. The chain is broken. The Crusader fleet moves up the river. Damietta is now fully blockaded by land and sea. At this moment, the Ayyubid Sultan al-Adil, Saladin's brother, dies of shock upon hearing the news. His son al-Kamil becomes the new sultan. Al-Kamil is smart, cautious, and a skilled diplomat. He realizes Damietta might fall, and if Damietta falls, Cairo is threatened, so he makes an offer. Al-Kamil proposes a deal to the Crusaders. Leave Egypt. In exchange, we will return Jerusalem, Bethlehem, and most of the territories lost after the Battle of Hattin. We will rebuild the walls of Jerusalem at our expense. We will return the relic of the true cross. It is an astonishing offer. The Crusaders would get everything they wanted without further fighting. Jerusalem returned peacefully. The Holy Land secured. The Crusader leaders debate the offer. Many want to accept. This is exactly why they came. But Cardinal Pelagius, the papal legate and de facto commander of the crusade, refuses. Pelagius is a hardliner. He does not trust the Muslims. He believes God wants them to conquer Egypt entirely, not negotiate. He argues that if they accept the offer and leave, Al-Kamil will just rebuild his forces and attack again. Better to finish the job and conquer Egypt. Pelagius overrules the other leaders. The offer is rejected. The siege continues. The siege of Damietta drags on for months. The city is heavily fortified and well supplied. The defenders hold out through the winter of 1218 and into 1219. Disease ravages both sides. Thousands die of plague, dysentery, and starvation. The Crusaders lose more men to disease than combat. By the summer of 1219, Damietta is starving. The Muslim garrison is down to a fraction of its original strength. On November 5th, 1219, the Crusaders launch a final assault. The defenders are too weak to resist. Damietta falls. The Crusaders enter the city and find streets littered with corpses. The population has been decimated by starvation and disease. The Crusaders have captured Damietta. They now control the gateway to the Nile Delta. The question is, what next? The logical next step is to advance on Cairo, but the Crusader army is exhausted, depleted, and in no condition to march. Pelagius decides to wait for reinforcements. Specifically, he is waiting for Frederick II, Holy Roman Emperor, who has taken the Crusade vow and promised to bring a massive army. Frederick keeps delaying. He has political problems in Italy. He has disputes with the Pope. He promises to come soon. The Crusaders wait and wait. They spend nearly 2 years occupying Damietta, doing nothing. Meanwhile, Al-Kamil is rebuilding his forces. He fortifies positions along the Nile. He digs canals and prepares defenses. He makes another offer to return Jerusalem in exchange for Damietta. Pelagius refuses again. By 1221, the Crusader leaders are getting impatient. Frederick is still not coming. They cannot wait forever. In July 1221, Pelagius orders the army to march on Cairo. The march is a disaster from the start. It is the middle of summer. The heat is unbearable. The Crusaders advance slowly down the east bank of the Nile, heading south toward Cairo. They do not bring enough supplies. They assume they can forage or resupply from ships on the river. But the Nile is about to flood. Every summer the Nile floods as snowmelt from the Ethiopian highlands pours into the river. This is well known. The Egyptians have been managing the flood cycle for thousands of years. Everyone knows it is coming. Pelagius either does not know or does not care. The Crusader army marches straight into the flood zone. By late July, the Crusaders are camped near the town of Mansoura, about halfway to Cairo. The Nile begins to rise. Al-Kamil, who has been waiting for this exact moment, opens the canal locks and dams upstream. Water floods the low-lying areas around the Crusader camp. Within days, the Crusaders are trapped. The Nile is flooding behind them, cutting off their retreat. Egyptian forces are in front of them, blocking the advance. The Crusader camp is surrounded by water and enemy soldiers. Supplies are running out, horses are drowning, men are dying of disease. The Crusader army is trapped in a swamp with no way out. Pelagius realizes he has made a catastrophic mistake. He has no choice but to negotiate. Al-Kamil offers terms: surrender, return Damietta, leave Egypt. In exchange, the Crusaders can leave peacefully with their lives. The Crusader leaders have no leverage. They accept. On August 30th, 1221, the Crusaders sign a truce. They abandon their camp and march back to Damietta in humiliation. They return the city to Egyptian control. An 8-year truce is agreed upon. The Crusaders evacuate Egypt entirely. The Fifth Crusade is over. It accomplished nothing. Damietta, captured after 18 months of brutal siege, is returned without a fight. Thousands of Crusaders died for nothing. Jerusalem is still in Muslim hands, Egypt is still the Ayyubid power base, and Pelagius the Cardinal, who refused 2 offers to peacefully reclaim Jerusalem, is blamed for the entire disaster. The Fifth Crusade failed because of leadership, but a lack of courage, but a lack of resources. Leadership. Pelagius was a religious zealot with no military experience and no understanding of logistics. He believed God would deliver victory regardless of strategy or planning. He rejected multiple opportunities for a negotiated peace that would have returned Jerusalem. He delayed for 2 years, waiting for Frederick II, who never came. He marched an army into a flood zone during flood season, and when the inevitable disaster occurred, he had to surrender everything the Crusaders had fought for. The other Crusader leaders knew Pelagius was incompetent and he was the papal legate. He had the authority of the Pope. No one could overrule him, so they followed his orders straight into the swamp. The Fifth Crusade is a case study in how bad leadership can destroy a well-planned campaign. The strategy was sound, the execution was a joke. Al-Kamil, on the other hand, conducted a masterclass in defensive warfare and diplomacy. He offered peace twice, knowing the Crusaders would reject it, and revealing their inflexibility. He avoided direct battle when the Crusaders were strong. He waited for them to overextend. He used the natural environment, the Nile flood, as a weapon. He surrounded them without losing his own army, and he negotiated their surrender without needing to storm their camp. Al-Kamil won the Fifth Crusade by letting the Crusaders defeat themselves. After the Crusaders leave, Al-Kamil consolidates his control over Egypt and Syria. The Ayyubid Sultanate is secure, and the lesson is clear to the Muslim world. The Crusaders are not invincible. They can be beaten through patience, strategy, and exploiting their own mistakes. The Fifth Crusade is remembered as the crusade that came so close and threw it all away. They captured Damietta, one of the greatest fortresses in Egypt. They were offered Jerusalem twice. They had the Sultan on the defensive, and they lost it because one man refused to accept victory when it was offered. In Europe, the failure is blamed on Pelagius, on Frederick II for not showing out, and on the Crusaders themselves for their arrogance. Pope Honorius is embarrassed. The next crusade will not be led by a cardinal, it will be led by an emperor, and that emperor will accomplish what the Fifth Crusade could not. He will reclaim Jerusalem without fighting a single battle. From Pope Innocent's call in 1215 to the surrender at Mansoura in 1221. 6 years that began with a sound strategy to conquer Egypt and ended with Crusaders trapped in a swamp, surrendering everything they had captured. The crusade that captured Damietta after 18 months of brutal siege, that was offered Jerusalem twice by Sultan Al-Kamil in exchange for peace, that rejected both offers because Cardinal Pelagius believed God wanted total victory, not negotiation. That waited 2 years for Frederick II, who never came. That marched on Cairo in July during flood season. That got trapped by the Nile flood exactly as Al-Kamil had planned. That surrendered and returned Damietta without a fight, accomplishing absolutely nothing. The Fifth Crusade proved that good strategy means nothing without competent leadership. That religious zeal does not compensate for understanding logistics or geography. That marching into a flood zone during flood season is strategically insane. That sometimes accepting victory through diplomacy is smarter than demanding victory through conquest. If you made it this far, you just learned the complete story of the Fifth Crusade. From the 18-month siege of Damietta to Sultan Al-Kamil's brilliant use of the Nile flood to trap the Crusader army. From Cardinal Pelagius rejecting Jerusalem twice to the humiliating surrender and evacuation of Egypt. The Crusade where everything almost worked. Where they captured one of the most fortified cities in Egypt. Where they were offered everything they came for twice. And where they threw it all away by following a religious zealot who believed God would deliver victory regardless of the laws of hydrology. Subscribe if you enjoyed this story of spectacular failure through incompetent leadership. The Sixth Crusade. March 18th, 1229. The Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem. An excommunicated emperor stands alone in the empty church. No patriarch will perform the ceremony because the Pope has banned him from the sacraments. So Frederick II places the crown on his own head. He crowns himself King of Jerusalem. The Sixth Crusade is the strangest crusade in history. It is led by an excommunicated emperor. It accomplishes its goal without fighting a single major battle. It reclaims Jerusalem through diplomacy, not warfare. The Pope condemns it. The Templars and Hospitallers refuse to participate. And yet it succeeds. For 15 years, Jerusalem is once again a Christian city. Not because of faith or military genius, but because one brilliant, cynical ruler decided to negotiate instead of fight. This is the story of Frederick II, the emperor who won a crusade by talking. Subscribe if you are not already subscribed. Let us begin. Frederick II is not your typical crusader. He is the Holy Roman Emperor, King of Sicily, King of Jerusalem by marriage, and one of the most intelligent, calculating, and secular rulers of the medieval period. He speaks 6 languages, including Arabic, He has Muslim bodyguards, keeps a harem, and writes treatises on falconry. He is nicknamed Stupor Mundi, the wonder of the world, because no one can figure him out. Medieval Christians are not sure if he is a genius or the Antichrist. Frederick takes the Crusade vow in 1215 during the same council that launches the Fifth Crusade, but he does not actually go. He has problems in Italy, he has political disputes with the Pope, he is busy consolidating his empire, he keeps promising to depart, he keeps delaying. By 1225, Pope Honorius III is dead, replaced by Pope Gregory IX. Gregory is less patient. He demands Frederick fulfill his vow immediately. Frederick promises. Again. In 1227, Frederick finally assembles an army and sets sail from Italy. Within days, plague breaks out on the ships. Frederick himself falls ill. The fleet turns back. Gregory is furious. He excommunicates Frederick for abandoning the crusade. Frederick protests that he was genuinely sick, but Gregory does not care. Frederick is excommunicated, banned from the sacraments, cut off from the church. Any Christian who helps him is also excommunicated. And then in June 1228, Frederick sets sail for the Holy Land anyway. He is going on crusade while excommunicated. The Pope is leading a crusade against the Emperor, and the Emperor is leading a crusade against the Muslims. Medieval politics is a nightmare. Frederick arrives in Acre in September 1228. He brings a small army, perhaps 10,000 men, not nearly enough to conquer Egypt or assault fortified cities. But Frederick does not plan to fight. He plans to negotiate. Frederick and the Ayyubid Sultan Al-Kamil have been in contact for years. They exchange letters, gifts, and philosophical debates. Al-Kamil is impressed by Frederick's knowledge of Arabic culture and Islamic scholarship. Frederick respects Al-Kamil's intelligence and political acumen. They are not friends exactly, but they understand each other. And both of them want to avoid a war. Al-Kamil is dealing with internal conflicts. His brother Al-Muazzam, the ruler of Damascus, died in 1227, and now Al-Kamil is trying to consolidate control over Syria. He does not need a crusade distracting him. Frederick, meanwhile, is under pressure to accomplish something before the Pope launches a full invasion of his Italian territories. He needs Jerusalem quickly, and he does not have the army to take it by force. So they negotiate. The Templars and Hospitallers hate this. They believe crusades should be fought with swords, not treaties. They refuse to cooperate with Frederick, partly because he is excommunicated, and partly because they distrust his methods. The local Frankish lords are also suspicious. Frederick is technically the king of Jerusalem by marriage, but his wife died years ago, and his claim is through his infant son. The barons do not consider him a legitimate ruler. Frederick ignores them off. He corresponds with Al-Kamil throughout the fall and winter of 1228. The terms are debated, adjusted, and refined. But Frederick uses both diplomacy and implicit threats. He cannot conquer Egypt, but he can raid the coast. He can disrupt trade. He can be a nuisance. Al-Kamil, for his part, is willing to give up Jerusalem. The city has minimal strategic value to the Ayyubids. It is isolated, difficult to defend, and expensive to maintain. The Dome of the Rock and Al-Aqsa Mosque are important, but Al-Kamil can ensure they remain under Muslim religious control even if Christians govern the city. If giving Frederick Jerusalem ends the crusade and gets the Franks out of his way, it is worth it. On February 18th, 1229, the Treaty of Jaffa is signed. The terms of the treaty are straightforward. Jerusalem, Bethlehem, Nazareth, and a corridor of land connecting Jerusalem to the coast are returned to Christian control. The Muslims retain control of the Temple Mount, including the Dome of the Rock and Al-Aqsa Mosque. Christians can visit the holy sites, but cannot hold religious services there. A 10-year truce is established. Neither side will attack the other. Fortifications in Jerusalem cannot be rebuilt. Frederick gets Jerusalem, the ultimate goal of every crusade since the first. Al-Kamil gets peace and the removal of the Crusader army from his territories. Both sides benefit, and no one has to fight. It is objectively a brilliant diplomatic achievement. The reaction is outrage. The Templars and Hospitallers condemn the treaty. They argue that the lack of fortifications makes Jerusalem indefensible. They complain that the Temple Mount remains under Muslim control. They accuse Frederick of betraying Christianity. The local Frankish lords are furious that Frederick negotiated without consulting them. And the Pope? Pope Gregory IX is apoplectic, Frederick is excommunicated. He has no authority to negotiate on behalf of Christendom. Any treaty he signs is illegitimate, and yet Jerusalem is Christian again. Gregory cannot publicly denounce the return of Jerusalem without looking like a hypocrite. So he issues a confusing statement that simultaneously condemns Frederick personally while acknowledging that Jerusalem has been reclaimed. It is a political disaster for the papacy. Frederick, meanwhile, does not care what anyone thinks. On March 18th, 1229, he enters Jerusalem. There is no patriarch to crown him because the church has placed Jerusalem under interdict due to Frederick's excommunication. So Frederick crowns himself King of Jerusalem in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. He wears the crown, gives a speech in which he praises his own brilliance, and then leaves. Frederick spends a total of 2 days in Jerusalem before returning to the coast. Frederick sails back to Italy in May 1229. Now, while he was on crusade, Pope Gregory launched an invasion of Frederick's territories in southern Italy. Papal forces occupy parts of Sicily. Frederick has to rush home to defend his kingdom. He defeats the papal armies, forces Gregory to negotiate, and eventually gets his excommunication lifted in 1230. The Sixth Crusade is over. Frederick accomplished what the Third, Fourth, and Fifth Crusades failed to do. He reclaimed Jerusalem without a major battle, without thousands of casualties, without bankrupting Europe or sacking Christian cities. He simply talked to the Sultan, made a reasonable deal, and took what he wanted. And everyone hated him for it, because it was not supposed to work that way. Crusades are supposed to be about faith, martyrdom, and glorious combat. Crusades are not supposed to be won by an excommunicated emperor negotiating with a Muslim sultan in Arabic. But Frederick did not care about how things were supposed to work. He cared about results, and the result was Jerusalem. The treaty lasts until 1239, when skirmishes resume. In 1244, Jerusalem falls to invading Khwarezmian Turks, allied with the Ayyubids. The city is sacked. The Christian population is massacred or enslaved. Jerusalem remains in Muslim hands for the next 673 years until the British capture it in 1917. Frederick's diplomatic triumph lasts 15 years, but those 15 years represent the longest period of Christian control over Jerusalem between 1187 and the modern era. It is more than any crusade after the first ever achieved, and it was accomplished without a battle. The Sixth Crusade is a paradox. It succeeds in its objective, but is condemned by the church. It reclaims Jerusalem, but is seen at a betrayal of crusading ideals. It is led by an excommunicated emperor and opposed by the Pope. It proves that diplomacy can be more effective than warfare, but no one wants to admit it, because admitting it would mean all the bloodshed, all the massacres, all the sieges and suffering of previous crusades were unnecessary. If Frederick can negotiate Jerusalem back, why did tens of thousands have to die at Hattin, Acre, and Damietta? The answer is uncomfortable. Maybe they did not have to. Maybe the entire premise of the Crusades, that holy war is the only way to reclaim the Holy Land, is wrong. Maybe Frederick's cynical, pragmatic diplomacy is more effective than Bernard of Clairvaux' apocalyptic rhetoric. But the church cannot accept that. Crusading is built on the idea that God rewards faith and punishes sin. If an excommunicated emperor can succeed where pious kings failed, what does that say about God's plan? So the church condemns Frederick even as Jerusalem returns to Christian hands. The strangest crusade in history. The most successful crusade after the first. The crusade that proved talking works better than fighting. The Seventh Crusade. April 6th, 1250. The Nile Delta in Egypt. A Crusader army is surrounded by Mamluk cavalry. The king is too sick with dysentery to ride. He is barely conscious. His brother Robert is already dead, killed in a reckless charge at Mansoura weeks earlier. The army is starving, diseased, and has no choice but to surrender. King Louis IX of France, the most pious monarch in Christendom, is captured by the Mamluks. The Seventh Crusade is what happens when the most pious king in Europe decides to personally save the Holy Land. He spends 4 years preparing, he raises a massive army, he captures Damietta, and then he gets captured himself. This is the story of how a saint led one of the best organized crusades in history straight into disaster. Subscribe if you are not already subscribed. Let us begin. The Seventh Crusade is called in response to another catastrophe in the Holy Land. In 1244, Jerusalem, briefly returned to Christian control by Frederick II's treaty, falls again. This time it is not Saladin or the Ayyubids, it is the Khwarezmian Turks, a displaced nomadic people fleeing Mongol invasions from the east. But the Khwarezmians sweep into the Holy Land as mercenaries allied with the Ayyubid Sultan of Egypt. They sack Jerusalem. The city is looted, burned, and depopulated. Churches are destroyed. The Christian population is massacred or enslaved. The Khwarezmians do not occupy the city, they just destroy it and move on. Jerusalem is left in ruins. On October 17th, 1244, a combined Crusader-Damascus alliance attempts to stop the Khwarezmians at the Battle of Laforbi near Gaza. It is a catastrophe. The Crusader army is annihilated. The military orders Templars and Hospitallers lose hundreds of knights. It is the worst Crusader defeat since Hattin. The Kingdom of Jerusalem is reduced to a handful of coastal cities. The Crusader states are on the verge of collapse. News of the disaster reaches Europe in 1245. King Louis IX of France takes the Crusade vow. Louis is 30 years old, already known for his piety and justice. He fasts regularly, prays for hours each day, and personally washes the feet of lepers. He sees the fall of Jerusalem as a personal calling. God is testing Christendom, and Louis believes he is the instrument of God's will. He will lead a crusade, reclaim Jerusalem, and restore Christian rule to the Holy Land. Unlike previous Crusader leaders who rushed into campaigns unprepared, Louis spends 4 years organizing. He raises taxes across France to fund the crusade. He builds a new port at Aigues-Mortes in southern France to launch his fleet. He stockpiles grain, weapons, and supplies. He recruits knights, soldiers, and engineers. He brings his wife, Queen Margaret, and much of the French nobility. This is not a ragtag expedition. This is a professional military operation, meticulously planned and lavishly funded. In August 1248, Louis sets sail with an army estimated at 15,000 men, including 2,500 knights. It is one of the largest and best-equipped crusade armies since the First Crusade. The target, as always, is Egypt. The Fifth Crusade proved that Egypt is the key to the Holy Land. Louis plans to conquer the Nile Delta, force the Ayyubids to surrender, and negotiate the return of Jerusalem. It is the same strategy that nearly worked in 1221. This time, Louis is determined to succeed. The fleet sails to Cyprus and winters there in 1248 and early 1249. Louis uses the time to finalize logistics and gather intelligence. He negotiates with Mongol envoys, hoping for an alliance against the Muslims. The Mongols are ravaging the Middle East, and Louis thinks they might be useful allies. The negotiations go nowhere. The Mongols are more interested in conquering than cooperating. In May 1249, the Crusader fleet departs Cyprus and sails for Egypt. The landing is contested. The Egyptian army is waiting on the beach near Damietta. The Crusaders launch an amphibious assault, storming the beach under fire. Knights wade ashore in full armor, shields raised against arrows. Louis himself is among the first to land sword in hand. The Egyptians retreat. The Crusaders secure the beachhead. On June 6, 1249, the Crusaders march on Damietta. The city, which took 18 months to capture during the Fifth Crusade, falls without a fight. The Egyptian garrison panics and evacuates during the night. The Crusaders walk into an empty, intact city. It is an astonishing stroke of luck. Damietta is the gateway to the Nile Delta. Louis does not want to advance until the full army is assembled, so the Crusaders occupy Damietta and wait. Weeks turn into months. Summer turns to fall. The Nile flood season comes and goes. The Crusaders sit in Damietta doing nothing. Meanwhile, the Ayyubid Sultan as-Salih Ayyub is dying. He has been ill for months, suffering from tuberculosis. In November 1249, as Salih dies, his death is kept secret. His widow, Shaja al-Dur, and the Mamluk commanders continue issuing orders in his name to prevent panic. The Mamluks are the elite slave soldier caste of the Ayyubid military. They are the most disciplined, most feared warriors in Egypt, and they are preparing for the Crusaders. Finally, in late November 1249, Louis decides to advance. Alphonse has arrived, the army is at full strength. The plan is to march south along the Nile toward Cairo, the Ayyubid capital. The Crusaders move slowly and cautiously, staying close to the river where supply ships can support them. By February 1250, they reach the town of Mansoura. Mansoura is a fortified town on the east bank of the Nile, about halfway between Damietta and Cairo. The Mamluks have fortified the town and are dug in on the opposite side of a canal. The Crusaders need to cross the canal to advance. Louis orders his engineers to build a causeway across the canal under the cover of siege towers. The Mamluks counter by digging the canal deeper and using Greek fire to burn the siege engines. The crossing stall. Then a local Egyptian offers to show the Crusaders a ford downstream where they can cross. At Valence, Louis's brother Robert of Artois leads the vanguard across the ford on February 8th, 1250. The crossing succeeds. The Crusaders are now on the east side of the canal. Robert should wait for the rest of the army to cross before advancing. But Robert is impulsive, arrogant, and eager for glory. The Templars accompanying him urge caution. Robert ignores them. He charges toward Mansoura with his cavalry. The Mamluks retreat into the town, appearing to flee in panic. Robert pursues. His knights crash through the gates of Mansoura and into the narrow streets. It is a trap. The Mamluks close the gates behind them. Archers appear on rooftops. Infantry block the streets. The Crusader cavalry is trapped in an urban kill zone with no room to maneuver. The Mamluks slaughter them. Robert of Artois is killed. Nearly ere the Templars with him are killed. Hundreds of knights are cut down in the streets. The survivors flee back toward the ford. St. Louis, arriving with the main army, is horrified. He has lost his brother and a significant portion of his vanguard in a single, reckless charge. The Crusaders regroup and launch a more disciplined assault on Mansoura. The battle rages for days. The Crusaders take heavy casualties but hold their position outside the town. The Mamluks cannot dislodge them, but the Crusaders cannot advance either. The campaign stalls into a bloody stalemate. By March 1250, the situation is deteriorating. The Crusaders are camped in the Nile Delta with supply lines stretching back to Damietta. Mamluk raiders begin attacking the supply convoys. Food runs low. Disease spreads through the camp. Dysentery and typhus ravage the army. Thousands of soldiers die. The Mamluks block the river with sunken ships, cutting off resupply by water. The Crusaders are starving. Louis realizes he has made a catastrophic mistake. He cannot advance to Cairo. He cannot hold his position. He has to retreat. In early April 1250, Louis orders a withdrawal back to Damietta. The retreat is a nightmare. The army is sick, starving, and demoralized. Mamluk cavalry harass the column constantly. Soldiers collapse and are left behind. On April 6, 1250, the Mamluks surround the retreating Crusader army. Louis is too sick with dysentery to ride. He is barely conscious. The Crusaders have no choice but to surrender. King Louis IX of France, the most pious monarch in Christendom, is captured by the Mamluks. The Mamluks negotiate Louis's ransom. The terms are steep. 400,000 livres tournois, an astronomical sum. The return of Damietta, the release of all Muslim prisoners held by the Crusaders. Louis has no choice but to agree. His wife, Queen Margaret, who has been holden to Damietta, negotiates the payment. She empties the French treasury, borrows from the Templars, and scrapes together the ransom. In May 1250, Louis is released. Damietta is returned to Egyptian control. The Crusaders evacuate Egypt. The Seventh Crusade has failed. Louis has lost his brother, thousands of soldiers, a fortune in gold, and the city of Damietta. And he has accomplished nothing. Most Crusader leaders would go home in disgrace. Louis does not. He refuses to return to France. Instead, he sails to Acre and spends the next 4 years in the Holy Land. He fortifies the remaining Crusader cities. He negotiates truces with the Mamluks. He ransoms Christian prisoners. He tries to rebuild what is left of the Crusader states. Louis becomes a living saint to the remaining Franks in the Holy Land. He shares their hardships, eats simple food, and works tirelessly to strengthen their defenses. But the reality is clear. The Crusader states are doomed. They survive only because the Mamluks are distracted by internal conflicts and Mongol invasions. In 1254, news reaches Louis that his mother Blanche of Castile, who has been ruling France in his absence, has died. Louis finally returns to France. He has been gone for 6 years. He spent 4 of those years as a prisoner, a ransomed king, or a failed crusader rebuilding fortresses that will fall within decades. The Seventh Crusade is a disaster for the same reason the Fifth Crusade was. The Nile Delta is a death trap. Advancing toward Cairo requires crossing waterways, dealing with floods, and maintaining impossibly long supply lines. Every crusade that invades Egypt ends the same way. Initial success, capture of Damietta, advance toward Cairo, stalled by logistics, disease, or flooding, retreat and surrender. Louis made the same mistakes as Pelagius. He waited too long in Damietta. He advanced at the wrong time. He underestimated the Mamluks. Louis's capture marks a turning point in the Crusades. For the first time, a reigning European monarch is held prisoner by Muslims. It is a humiliation that reverberates across Europe. The Seventh Crusade proves that even the most pious, best prepared, best funded crusade can fail. Faith alone is not enough. Organization alone is not enough. If you made it this far, you just learned the complete story of the Seventh Crusade. Subscribe if you enjoyed this story of tragic failure by a genuinely good man. Drop a comment on whether you want the Eighth Crusade next, where Louis dies of plague, and I will see you in the next one. The Eighth Crusade. The Ninth Crusade. August 25th, 1270. A tent outside Tunis in North Africa. King Louis IX of France lies dying of dysentery. He is 55 years old. He has been in North Africa for barely a month. He has not fought a single battle. He has not even entered the city he came to conquer. His youngest son, John Tristan, died 3 weeks ago from the same disease. Thousands of soldiers are dead or dying around him in the camp. The heat is unbearable. The stench of death fills the air, and Louis, the Saint King who crusaded twice, is about to die having accomplished nothing. The Eighth Crusade lasts less than 2 months. King Louis, having failed spectacularly in Egypt during the Seventh Crusade, decides to try again 16 years later. He sails to North Africa, camps outside Tunis in the middle of summer, and dies of dysentery. The crusade ends immediately. Subscribe if you are not already subscribed. Let us begin. By the 1260s, the Crusader states are collapsing. The Mamluks, the slave soldier caste that rose to power in Egypt, have taken control of the Ayyubid territories. In 1260, the Mamluk general Baybars seizes power and becomes sultan. Baybars is brilliant, ruthless, and relentless. He systematically dismantles the Crusader states city by city. In 1265, he captures Caesarea and Arsuf. In 1266, he takes Safed after a brutal siege. In 1268, he captures Jaffa and then Antioch. Antioch, one of the greatest Crusader cities, one of the original prizes of the First Crusade, falls in 4 days. Baybars massacres the population. 17,000 Christians are killed, 100,000 are enslaved. The Principality of Antioch ceases to exist. By 1270, only a handful of coastal cities remain in Crusader hands: Acre, Tripoli, Tyre. The Kingdom of Jerusalem is reduced to a narrow strip of coastline. It is only a matter of time before the Mamluks finish the job. In Europe, the fall of Antioch causes panic. If the Crusader states fall entirely, the Holy Land will be lost forever. King Louis IX, now in his 50s, decides he must act. Louis has never forgiven himself for the failure of the Seventh Crusade. He spent 4 years in the Holy Land after his release, trying to rebuild what he had destroyed. When he returned to France in 1254, he dedicated himself to ruling justly and preparing for another crusade. He arbitrates disputes, reforms the legal system, and lives an ascetic life of prayer and fasting. He is obsessed with redemption. In 1267, Louis takes the cross again. He announces a new crusade. He is older, weaker, and sicker than he was during the Seventh Crusade. His advisors beg him not to go. His health is failing. France needs him at home. Another crusade to Egypt will end the same way as the last one. Louis does not care. God is calling him. He will answer. Preparations begin. Louis raises funds, assembles an army, and commissions ships. But this time something is different. The target is not Egypt, it is Tunis. The decision to attack Tunis is one of the most debated choices in Crusade history. The official explanation is that the Emir of Tunis, Muhammad I, al-Mustansir, has expressed interest in converting to Christianity. If Tunis converts, it could become a Christian ally in North Africa and a base for future operations against Egypt. This is almost certainly nonsense. There is no evidence the emir ever seriously considered conversion. The real reason is probably political and financial. Louis's brother Charles of Anjou, King of Sicily, has been feuding with Tunis over unpaid tribute. Charles stands to profit enormously if Tunis is conquered or forced to pay. Charles may have convinced Louis that Tunis is the key to unlocking the Holy Land. Conquer Tunis, convert the emir, establish a base in North Africa, then launch a renewed assault on Egypt. It is a convoluted plan that makes little strategic sense, but Louis, desperate for any path to redemption, agrees. On July 1st, 1270, the Crusade fleet depart from Aigues-Mortes in southern France. Louis sails with an army of perhaps 10,000 men. It is far smaller than the Seventh Crusade. Fewer nobles join. Many knights have learned from the previous disaster and refuse to follow Louis into another doomed campaign. But Louis does not need a massive army. He believes God will provide. The fleet arrives near Carthage, just outside Tunis, on July 18th, 1270. The landing is unopposed. The Crusaders establish a camp on the beach near the ruins of ancient Carthage. Louis plans to wait for Charles of Anjou, who is bringing reinforcements from Sicily. The emir of Tunis, meanwhile, watches from the city walls and does nothing. He does not attack. He does not negotiate. He just waits. The Crusaders sit in their camp under the blazing North African sun. It is the height of summer. The heat is unbearable. The water supply is inadequate. Sanitation is terrible. Within days, disease begins to spread. Dysentery, typhoid, possibly plague. The exact illness is unclear, but it spreads rapidly through the camp. Soldiers die by the hundreds. And Louis's youngest son, John Tristan, dies on August 3rd. Louis himself falls ill. He is 55 years old, already weakened by decades of fasting and self-denial. The disease ravages him. By mid-August, he is bedridden, barely conscious. On August 25, 1270, King Louis IX of France dies in his tent outside Tunis. He never fought a battle. He never entered the city. He never even saw the emir. He died of disease in a camp surrounded by corpses, having accomplished nothing. Charles of Anjou arrives with his fleet the day after Louis dies. He finds the crusade in chaos. Thousands of soldiers are dead or dying. The army is demoralized and leaderless. Charles takes command and negotiates a treaty with the emir of Tunis. The terms are simple. The Crusaders leave. Tunis pays an indemnity to Charles to cover his expenses and settle the tribute dispute. Christian merchants are guaranteed safe passage in Tunisian ports. On November 1st, 1270, the treaty is signed. The crusade is over. The fleet sails back to Europe. Louis's body is taken to France. His bones are enshrined in the Basilica of Saint-Denis. In 1297, Pope Boniface VIII canonizes Louis as a saint. Saint Louis IX, the king, who crusaded twice, failed twice, and died for his faith. The Eighth Crusade achieves nothing. It does not help the Crusader states. It does not weaken the Mamluks. It does not convert Tunis. It kills a king and thousands of soldiers for no reason. The Eighth Crusade is remembered as a tragedy and a farce. Tragic because Louis genuinely believed he was serving God. He was a good man, a just king, and a devout Christian. He died trying to save the Holy Land. But it is also a farce because the entire campaign was pointless. Tunis was never a realistic target. The emir was never going to convert. The crusade was launched for the wrong reasons, aimed at the wrong target, and doomed from the start. Louis' death marks the end of an era. He was the last major European monarch to personally lead a crusade. After Louis, crusading becomes a niche activity. Minor nobles, younger sons, and adventurers continue to launch expeditions, but the great kings of Europe stop going. They have learned the lesson Louis never did. Crusades do not work. They are expensive, dangerous, and almost always end in failure. Faith is not enough. Piety is not enough. Good intentions are not enough. And dying in a tent of dysentery is not martyrdom. It is just a waste. The Crusader states do not benefit from the Eighth Crusade. They receive no reinforcements, no supplies, no aid. Baybars continues his conquests. In 1271, he captures the Crac des Chevaliers, the greatest fortress in the Holy Land. In 1289, Tripoli falls. In 1291, Acre, the last major Crusader city, falls after a brutal siege. The Crusader states are gone. 2 centuries after the First Crusade captured Jerusalem, the dream is over. In Louis's crusades, the 7th and 8th do nothing to stop the collapse. If anything, they accelerated the connection. The wealth and manpower wasted on Egypt and Tunis could have been used to reinforce the defenses of Acre or Tripoli. But Louis believed God wanted him to crusade, not to build walls. So he crusaded twice, and both times he failed. He believed the crusade would work because it had to work. He was wrong, and his death outside Tunis, surrounded by disease and failure, is the final proof that crusading is over. The age of holy war has passed. The Mamluks have won. The Crusader states will fall. If you made it this far, you just learned the complete story of the Eighth Crusade. The shortest, saddest crusade in history. The crusade that killed a saint king for no reason. Subscribe if you enjoyed this story of tragic, pointless death. Drop a comment on whether you want the Ninth Crusade next, where Prince Edward survives an assassination attempt, and I will see you in the next one. The Ninth Crusade. June 16th, 1272. Acre. Prince Edward of England is reading a message in his quarters when the messenger lunges with a concealed dagger. The blade strikes Edward's arm. It is poisoned. Edward, a trained warrior, reacts instantly, wrestling the assassin to the ground and killing him with his bare hands. The Ninth Crusade is barely a crusade. It is led by Prince Edward, the future Edward I, one of the most formidable military commanders of his era. But Edward does not bring an army. He brings about 1,000 soldiers. He does not conquer cities. He conducts raids. He negotiates a truce. Then someone tries to assassinate him. The Ninth Crusade is less of a holy war and more of a diplomatic mission, with occasional violence and one very dramatic stabbing. This is the story of the last crusade to the Holy Land and the prince who barely survived it. Subscribe if you are not already subscribed. Let us begin. By 1270, the Crusader states are dying. Baybars, the Mamluk Sultan, has spent a decade systematically destroying them. City after city falls. Antioch is gone. Jaffa is gone. Caesarea, Arsuf, Safed, gone. Only a handful of coastal strongholds remain: Acre, Tripoli, Tyre, and a few castles. The fall of Acre is inevitable. It is only a matter of time. In 1270, as King Louis IX dies outside Tunis during the Eighth Crusade, another crusader is preparing to set sail. Prince Edward of England, the eldest son of King Henry III. Edward is 31 years old. Tall, athletic, and already a hardened warrior. He fought in the English civil wars, crushed rebellions, and earned a reputation for ruthlessness and tactical brilliance. He took the Crusade vow in 1268, inspired by the fall of Antioch. But Edward is not naive. He knows the Crusader states cannot be saved by another massive, doomed invasion of Egypt. He knows the age of grand crusades is over. His goal is more modest. Go to the Holy Land, reinforce Acre, buy time, maybe negotiate a truce with the Mamluks. That is it. Not liberation, not conquest, just survival. Edward departs England in 1270 with a small force. Estimates vary, but he probably has around 1,000 men total, including knights, crossbowmen, and support personnel. It is a tiny army by Crusade standards. The First Crusade had tens of thousands. The Seventh Crusade had 15,000. Edward has 1,000. But Edward is not trying to conquer Egypt. He is trying to stabilize what is left. Edward stops in Sicily to join the survivors of the Eighth Crusade. He learns that Louis is dead, the crusade is over, and everyone is going home. Most of the French crusaders sail back to France. Edward continues to the Holy Land anyway. He arrives in Acre on May 9th, 1271. The local Frankish lords are stunned. A prince of England has actually shown up with an army. Small, but still. It is the first significant reinforcement they have received in years. Edward immediately begins organizing raids. Edward is not interested in besieging cities. He does not have the manpower. Instead, he launches lightning raids into Mamluk-controlled territory. He targets supply lines, raids villages, and harasses Muslim forces. It is guerrilla warfare, not conquest. The goal is to disrupt Baybars and demonstrate that the Crusaders are still dangerous. Edward also pursues diplomacy. He sends envoys to the Mongol Ilkhanate ruled by Abaga Khan. The Mongols have been expanding westward, conquering Muslim territories and clashing with the Mamluks. Edward proposes an alliance. Coordinate attacks, crush the Mamluks between Christian and Mongol forces. Abaga agrees. In the fall of 1271, a combined Mongol Crusader force raids Aleppo in northern Syria. The raid is successful, the city is looted. Mamluk forces are caught off guard. For a moment it seems like the alliance might work, but the Mongols do not follow through. They withdraw back to their territories. The alliance collapses. Edward is left alone again. By early 1272, it is clear Edward cannot accomplish anything significant with such a small force. Baibars is too strong, the Mamluks control too much territory, and the Crusader states are too weak to be saved. Edward negotiates a truce. In May 1272, Edward and Baibars agree to a 10-year truce. The terms are simple. The Mamluks stop attacking the remaining Crusader cities. The Crusaders stop raiding Mamluk territory. Both sides maintain the status quo. It is not victory. It is not even success. It is just a temporary pause in the inevitable collapse. But it buys the Crusader states another decade. Acre, Tripoli, and Tyre get 10 more years. Edward prepares to leave. He has done what he came to do. He reinforced the defenses, conducted raids, negotiated a truce. There is nothing more he can accomplish. He plans to depart in the summer of 1272. And then someone tries to kill him. On June 16th, 1272, Edward is in his quarters in Acre. A man enters claiming to be an emissary with a message. Some sources say he is sent by Baibars. Others say he is a member of the Assassins, the secretive Islamic sect known for political murders. The exact identity is unclear. What is clear is that the man is carrying a concealed dagger. As Edward reads the supposed message, the assassin lunges. He stabs Edward in the arm with the poisoned blade. Edward reacts instantly. He is a trained warrior, and even wounded, he is dangerous. Edward wrestles the assassin to the ground and kills him with his bare hands. Some accounts say Edward kicked him to death. Others say he grabbed the dagger and stabbed the assassin repeatedly. The details vary, but the result is the same. The assassin is dead, Edward is wounded, and the dagger was poisoned. The poison spreads through Edward's arm. The wound festers. Edward falls ill. His advisors panic. Medieval medicine has no reliable treatment for poison. The standard approach is to cut away the infected flesh and hope for the best. A surgeon begins carving out the poisoned tissue. Edward, according to legend, remains conscious and stoic throughout the procedure. He watches the surgeon cut into his arm without flinching. The most famous legend of the assassination attempt involves Edward's wife, Eleanor of Castile. According to the story, Eleanor sucked the poison from the wound to save Edward's life. It is a romantic tale. It is also probably not true. The story does not appear in contemporary accounts. It shows up in later chronicles, likely embellished for dramatic effect. The reality is probably less romantic. Edward survived because the surgeon removed the infected tissue in time, and because Edward was young, strong, and resilient. Eleanor was certainly there caring for him during his recovery, but the dramatic poison-sucking scene is likely fiction. Edward spends weeks recovering. By September 1272, he is well enough to travel. He finally departs Acre and begins the long journey home. While Edward is sailing back to Europe, he receives news. His father, King Henry III, has died. Edward is now King Edward I of England. He does not rush home. He stops in Sicily. He visits the Pope in Rome. He travels through France and does not reach England until 1274, nearly 2 years after his father's death. Edward's delayed return does not matter. England is stable, and his officials have been governing in his absence. Edward is crowned in 1274 and immediately begins the work of consolidating royal power. He conquers Wales, he invades Scotland, he reforms English law, he earns the nickname Hammer of the Scots and becomes one of England's most effective and ruthless kings. He never returns to the Holy Land. The Ninth Crusade is the last numbered crusade to the Holy Land. After Edward leaves, no European monarch launches another expedition. There are occasional smaller crusades, minor campaigns, and isolated efforts to help the Crusader states, but the great age of crusading is over. Edward's truce with Baibars lasts until 1282. Baibars dies in 1277, but his successors continue his work. In 1289, Tripoli falls to the Mamluks. In 1291, Acre, the last major Crusader city, is besieged. The Mamluks attack with overwhelming force. Tens of thousands of soldiers, siege engines, constant bombardment. The Knights Templar, Hospitallers, and Teutonic Knights fight to the last man. The walls are breached, the city falls, the defenders are slaughtered, the population is massacred or enslaved. On May 18, 1291, the Crusader kingdom of Jerusalem ceases to exist. 2 centuries after the First Crusade captured the city, the dream is over. Legs, the Crusades to the Holy Land are finished. The Ninth Crusade accomplished almost nothing. Edward conducted a few successful raids. He negotiated a truce that delayed the inevitable for a decade. He survived an assassination attempt, but he did not save the Crusader states. He could not. By the time Edward arrived, the situation was hopeless. The Mamluks were too strong, the Crusader states were too weak, the European powers were too distracted by their own war to send meaningful reinforcements. Edward's crusade is significant not because of what it accomplished, but because of what it represents. The end. After Edward, no king bothers. Crusading becomes a historical curiosity, a relic of a more naive age when people believed faith and steel could conquer the world. Edward himself never crusades again. He spends the rest of his life conquering Wales and Scotland, building castles and centralizing English power. He is far more successful as a king than he ever was as a crusader. The Ninth Crusade is a footnote, a minor campaign led by a future king who accomplished little and nearly died in the process. But it marks the end of an era. After Edward crusading to the Holy Land stops, the Crusader states fall. The dream of a Christian Jerusalem dies, and Europe moves on. The age of crusading is replaced by the age of nation-states, professional armies, and gunpowder. The medieval world is ending. Edward I is part of the transition. He is the last Crusader king, and the first modern monarch. If you made it this far, you just learned the complete story of the Ninth Crusade. From Edward arriving in Acre with 1,000 men to conducting raids and negotiating truces. From surviving an assassination attempt with a poisoned dagger. Subscribe if you enjoyed this story of the quiet end. Drop a comment on what Crusade content you want next, and I will see you in the next one.